In Holt Penitentiary's C block, a black inmate was about to remind a white prison guard that no chain is unbreakable. What started as a forced assignment to the rival gang's yard spiraled when CO Dwayne Keller decided to make an example out of DeShawn Carter. DeShawn Carter wasn't your typical lifer. For 15 years he had endured beatings, isolation, and orchestrated humiliations, known for his unbreakable composure, the kind that made weaker men nervous. When Keller set Carter up for a brutal beating at the hands of rival inmates, he had no idea he was messing with a man who had already survived the worst they could throw at him. Carter endured, never breaking, never giving them the satisfaction of a plea. Only a silent promise that Keller would regret this. That single look was all it took to change the air in Holt forever. What began as a sadistic display of power would become a reckoning. The prison walls would tremble the day CO Dwayne Keller realized he had finally pushed too far. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. CO Dwayne Keller's boots echoed on the concrete floor of Holt Penitentiary's C block, a rhythmic sound that inmates had learned to fear. 6'4" with shoulders like steel beams, he walked the tier with the swagger of a man who knew he was untouchable. His nightstick tapped against his thigh, a habit, a warning, a promise. "Look alive, animals," Keller barked, his Louisiana drawl stretching the words. "Recreation time, single file, you know the drill." Black inmates lined up on one side, white on the other, Holt's unwritten but rigidly enforced segregation. Keller's eyes scanned the line until they found their target, DeShawn Carter, inmate 472891, known throughout the prison as D-Lo. Carter stood silent, eyes forward, face unreadable. The man had spent 15 years of a life sentence developing the kind of patience that made COs nervous. All except Keller. To him, Carter's composure was an insult. "Carter!" Keller's voice boomed. "Front and center." The tall, lean inmate stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. Nothing in his face betrayed emotion, but his eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed on Keller with an intensity that would have made a smarter man pause. "Got a special assignment for you today." Keller's mouth twisted into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Thought you might enjoy some exercise with our friends from D block." A muscle in Carter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. D block housed the Latin kings who had a violent history with the black inmates from C block. Behind Carter, a ripple of tension moved through the line. "Something wrong with your hearing, boy?" Keller stepped closer, the word boy dripping with decades of Southern hatred. "No, sir," Carter replied, his voice low and steady. "Good, 'cause I'd hate to add another mark to your record." Keller leaned in, close enough that only Carter could hear. "Been a while since I've had to teach you your place, getting nostalgic." From further down the line, Tyrone Big T Lawson shifted his weight, his massive frame tensing. At 38, Big T had been running things on the inside for a decade. His scarred knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists, but he remained in line. Next to him, young Isaiah Zay Moore, barely 22 and serving his first year of a 15-year sentence, looked ready to explode. Big T placed a warning hand on Zay's arm. "Not now. Not yet." The yard buzzed with the controlled chaos of recreation time. Guards stood at strategic points, hands resting on their weapons, watching. Ray Henshaw, another CO cut from the same cloth as Keller, stood by the weight pile, his pale blue eyes tracking every movement of the black inmates with barely concealed disgust. Brent Holloway, newer to the job and still uncomfortable with Holt's unofficial racial policies, shifted nervously by the basketball court. He'd heard whispers about what Keller had planned, but kept his mouth shut. 6 months on the job had taught him that survival meant looking the other way. Keller guided Carter to the far corner of the yard where 3 D-block inmates waited. Muscled, tattooed, they eyed Carter with predatory anticipation. This wasn't a chance meeting. This was an execution. "Seems these gentlemen have a grievance with you, Carter," Keller announced loudly enough for nearby inmates to hear, "Something about your boys jumping one of theirs in the laundry last month." It was a lie and everyone knew it, but it was a pretext and that was all Keller needed. "I wasn't involved in that," Carter stated, his voice still even despite the gravity of his situation. "Not what I heard." Keller stepped back, gesturing to the D-block inmates. "Maybe you can work it out man to man. I believe in rehabilitation through communication." A few white inmates nearby snickered. Keller's racism was legendary, his violent philosophy well established. This wasn't rehabilitation. This was blood sport. "CO Keller," Carter said, still refusing to show fear. "You know this isn't right." "What I know," Keller replied, leaning in again, "is that you've been getting too comfortable lately. Too respected. Time to remind everyone what you really are." With that, Keller stepped back and nodded to the D-block inmates. 10 minutes? Gentlemen, make 'em count." The first punch came from the largest of the three, a heavily tattooed man with muerte inked across his knuckles. It connected with Carter's jaw with a sickening crack. Carter staggered but didn't fall. He raised his hands not to fight back, but in a defensive posture. "Fight back, you coward!" Keller shouted, but Carter refused. The second attacker drove a knee into Carter's stomach, doubling him over. The third landed a hook to his temple that finally dropped him to the concrete. Blood splattered on the ground as the beating continued. Across the yard, the C-block inmates watched in growing rage. Big T's face had turned to stone, his eyes burning holes through Keller. Zay trembled with barely contained fury. "We gotta do something," Zay whispered desperately. "We will," Big T answered, his voice a low rumble. "Just not what they expect, not yet." By the basketball court, C.O. Holloway looked away, shame burning in his chest. He caught the eye of Warden Ellis Grayson, who had appeared on the observation deck above the yard. The warden watched dispassionately for a moment before turning away. Another day at Holt Penitentiary. On the ground, Carter endured. Each blow seemed to bend but never break him. Blood ran from his mouth. His left eye was swelling shut. But still, he made no sound. No plea for mercy. Then, something changed. As a boot connected with his ribs, Carter's eyes opened. Through the blood and sweat, he found Keller. Their gazes locked, and in that moment something passed between them. A silent communication that sent an involuntary shiver down Keller's spine. It wasn't fear in Carter's eyes. It wasn't even hate. It was promise. Keller's triumphant smile faltered for just a second before he reassembled it. "All right, that's enough," he called out, signaling the guards to break it up. "I think he's learned his lesson." The D-block inmates backed away, breathing hard, knuckles bloody. Carter remained on the ground, his chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Two guards hauled him to his feet. His face was a mask of blood, one eye swollen shut, lips split in multiple places. But his one good eye remained fixed on Keller, unwavering. "Get him to the infirmary," Keller ordered, suddenly uncomfortable under that steady gaze. "Can't have him dying on my watch. Paperwork's a bitch." As they dragged Carter away, Keller noticed the yard had gone silent. Every black inmate stood watching, their faces impassive but their eyes burning with something dangerous. Even the white inmates seemed subdued, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "Show's over," Keller shouted. "Back to your activities before. I end rec time early." Slowly, movement resumed in the yard, but it was different. Subdued. Calculating. Keller wiped his hands on his uniform as if cleaning away something unpleasant. He caught Henshaw's eye and received an approving nod. Everything had gone according to plan. Carter had been humiliated, his status diminished. The natural order of Holt Penitentiary had been reinforced. Yet as Keller walked back toward the building, clipboard in hand and authority re-established, he couldn't shake the feeling of Carter's gaze following him. Couldn't forget that look, that silent promise. He shrugged it off. What could a beaten, bloodied inmate possibly do to him? He was CO Dwayne Keller. He owned this place. That night, Keller made his final rounds before the shift change. C block. was unusually quiet. Normally there was chatter, movement, the background noise of 200 men in cages. Tonight silence fell as he walked the tier. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men turned away or stared through him with blank expressions. Even the white inmates seemed distant, watchful. "What's the matter with you animals? Cat got your tongues?" Keller called out, irritation masking a flutter of unease. No one answered. No one moved. As he passed Carter's empty cell, its occupant still in the infirmary, Keller noticed Big T watching him from 3 cells down. The massive inmate's expression was unreadable, but his eyes followed Keller with the focus of a predator. "Got something to say, Lawson?" Keller challenged. Big T simply shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing at all, CO Keller. Just thinking about tomorrow." "What's tomorrow?" Keller asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Big T's smile widened, revealing a gold front tooth. "Tomorrow's always coming, CO. That's all." Keller moved on, brushing off the cryptic response, but as he left the block, the silence followed him, heavy with anticipation. Something had changed. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. He didn't know it yet, but Dwayne Keller's tomorrows were numbered, and DeShawn Carter's promise hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and gathering strength. 3 days after the beating, Keller arrived for his morning shift, expecting the usual, inmates moving aside as he walked through, eyes downcast, voices hushed with fear. The routine had always fed something essential inside him, a hunger for dominance that stretched back to his childhood, when his father taught him that respect came from making others afraid. Instead, he stepped into a world subtly altered. On the tier, inmates still parted before him, but their eyes didn't drop. They watched him, expressions blank but gazes steady. No one spoke, but their silence felt deliberate rather than fearful. "Morning, gentlemen," Keller announced, forcing a broad smile to mask his unease. "Beautiful day to be alive, ain't it?" No response, just that wall of quiet observation. Keller continued his walk to the staff locker room, his bravado slipping with each step. Inside, he found CO Brent Holloway changing into his uniform, his movements hurried. "Morning, Holloway," Keller said, spinning the combination on his locker. "Inmates acting strange to you today?" Holloway glanced up, then quickly away. "Haven't noticed anything." "Bullshit, you haven't. They're quiet. Too quiet." Holloway shrugged, avoiding Keller's eyes. "Carter's back from the infirmary today." "Maybe. That's it." Keller's hand paused on his locker door. "Already? Thought the doc said a week minimum. Guess he heals fast." Holloway closed his locker and headed for the door, then paused. "You really did a number on him, Keller, even for you." "He had it coming," Keller snapped. "Since when do you care about these animals?" Holloway didn't answer. He just shook his head slightly and left, leaving Keller alone with a strange new feeling, a hollowness in his stomach, a tightness in his chest. Opening his locker, Keller reached for his gear. As he pulled out his uniform shirt, something caught his eye, a crude etching on the metal interior of his locker door, fresh enough that metal shavings still dusted the shelf below. One word: tomorrow. Keller slammed the locker shut, heart suddenly hammering. His eyes darted around the empty room. How? Who? His locker had been locked. He spun around, checking corners, behind benches, looking for, what? Someone watching? Laughing? He reopened the locker slowly, hoping he'd imagined it. The word remained, jagged and accusatory. Tomorrow. At morning lineup, Warden Ellis Grayson briefed the guards with his usual cold efficiency. Tall and rail-thin with silver hair cropped military short, Grayson ran Holt Penitentiary like a business rather than a correctional facility. Less trouble meant less oversight, which meant more opportunities for the various schemes that lined his pockets. "Tension's high after the incident in the yard," Grayson announced. "Keep your eyes open. No tolerance for any whisper of retaliation." His pale eyes settled on Keller for a beat too long. "Something you want to add, Warden?" Keller challenged. the word in his locker burning in his mind. "Just wondering if you've got your animals under control, Keller," Grayson replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to make several guards shift uncomfortably. "Always do," Keller said with forced confidence. "Good." Grayson's thin lips formed, what passed for a smile. "Because I'd hate for your extracurricular activities to become my problem." The message was clear. Grayson tolerated Keller's brutality as long as it didn't disrupt the prison's delicate ecosystem or attract outside attention. The moment it did, Keller would be on his own. As the guards dispersed to their posts, Henshaw caught up with Keller in the corridor. "Warden's got a stick up his ass today," Henshaw muttered. "Don't sweat it. Worth it to see Carter taken down a notch." Keller nodded but didn't mention the message in his locker. Something held him back, a sense that admitting fear would make it real. "You hear Carter's back already?" he asked instead. Henshaw's face darkened. "Yeah, tough son of a bitch, I'll give him that. Should have let those boys finish the job." "Next time," Keller said, trying to sound like his old self. Henshaw clapped him on the shoulder and headed toward D Block. As he walked away, Keller noticed something he'd never seen before, a small tattoo on the back of Henshaw's neck, partially hidden by his collar. It looked like a runic symbol, one Keller had seen on pamphlets passed among the white inmates. The thought that Henshaw might have connections beyond their shared racism, might be part of something organized, lingered uneasily as Keller headed to C Block. DeShawn Carter stood in his cell, hands resting lightly on the small metal sink as he studied his reflection in the polished steel mirror. His face told the story of Keller's orchestrated beating, left eye still swollen, though no longer shut. A line of stitches tracking across his cheekbone, split lip puffed and dark. Beneath his prison-issue shirt, his ribs were wrapped tightly, two of them cracked. He straightened as footsteps approached, the distinctive stride he'd learned to recognize over 15 years. Keller appeared at the bars. Well, look who's back. Thought you'd be enjoying the infirmary's hospitality a bit longer." Carter turned slowly, his good eye finding Keller's. He said nothing. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Keller's voice carried a forced bravado that hadn't been there before. "Or maybe they knocked something loose in that thick skull of yours." Carter remained silent, his gaze steady. "You got something to say to me, boy, you better say it now," Keller pressed, his hand instinctively moving to his nightstick. After a long moment, Carter finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Tomorrow comes for everybody, Mr. Keller." A chill ran through Keller, the same word. He masked it with a harsh laugh. "That's supposed to be a threat? Might need to remind you who's wearing the uniform and who's wearing the jumpsuit." Carter turned back to the sink without responding, dismissing Keller as if he were nothing. Rage flared in Keller's chest, temporarily drowning out the fear. He slammed his nightstick against the bars. "You watch yourself, Carter. I'm not done with you, not by a long shot." No response. Just that impenetrable silence that had somehow become more threatening than any words could be. Keller continued his rounds, but the interaction had left him shaken. As he walked the tier, he noticed inmates watching him from their cells, their eyes following his movement. No one called out the usual insults or complaints. They just watched. In the yard that afternoon, Keller stood by the fence, hand resting on his baton, scanning the clusters of inmates. The usual segregation was in effect. Black inmates by the basketball court and weight pile, whites by the handball wall, Latinos near the pull-up bars. But there was something different about how they moved today, particularly the black inmates. They seemed coordinated somehow, their conversations too quiet to overhear, their gestures subtly communicating something Keller couldn't decode. Carter sat alone on a bench, his injuries making exercise impossible. Despite his isolation, there was a constant flow of acknowledgement, inmates nodding to him as they passed, a touch on the shoulder, a word spoken close to his ear. Even from across racial lines, there were nods of respect. "The hell is going on?" Keller muttered to himself. So Holloway, standing nearby, glanced at him. "What's that?" "Look at them," Keller said. "Something's up. They're planning something." Holloway followed his gaze. Looks like normal rec time to me. Then you're not paying attention. Before Holloway could respond, Big T detached himself from a group by the weights and approached Carter. The massive inmate sat beside him, their conversation too low to hear. After a moment, both men looked directly at Keller. Something in their synchronized gaze sent another chill through him. He pushed off from the fence and strode toward them, needing to reassert control. "Awful cozy over here," Keller said, stopping in front of the bench. "Planning a dinner date?" Big T looked up, his face expressionless. "Just checking on my man, making sure he's healing right." "That right? And what's the prognosis, Dr. Lawson?" Big T's eyes flicked to Carter, then back to Keller. "He'll be just fine. Everything heals. Everything changes." "That's supposed to mean something?" Keller demanded. "Just making conversation, CO Keller." Big T stood, his 6'5" frame towering even over Keller. "Unless talking to us animals is beneath you today." Keller's hand tightened on his baton. "Watch your mouth, Lawson." "Or what? You'll have some Latin kings jump me too?" Big T shook his head. "Ain't got nothing to say to dead men anyway." The words hit Keller like a physical blow. He stepped back involuntarily. "What did you just say?" Big T just smiled, gold tooth glinting in the sunlight, and walked away. Carter remained seated, his one good eye still fixed on Keller with that same unnerving steadiness. "You put him up to this?" Keller demanded. "Think I'm scared of some cryptic bullshit?" Carter simply blinked, then looked away, dismissing Keller again. Across the yard, Keller noticed young Zay Moore watching the interaction intently, a barely suppressed smile on his face. When their eyes met, Zay mouthed a single word: "Tomorrow." In the staff cafeteria that evening, Keller sat alone. He'd noticed other guards giving him a wide berth all day, conversations stopping when he approached, resuming when he passed. Even Henshaw had been scarce, citing work in another block. He pushed his tray away, appetite gone. What the hell was happening? 3 days ago, he'd been king of this place. Now it felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "Mind if I join you?" Keller looked up to find Warden Grayson standing over him, tray in hand. Without waiting for an answer, Grayson sat. "Something on your mind, Keller? You look unsettled." Keller considered mentioning the message in his locker, the strange behavior of the inmates, Big T's comment about dead men. But Grayson's calculating expression stopped him. Showing weakness to the warden was never wise. "Just tired," he lied. "Long shift." Grayson nodded, cutting his meat with precise movements. "I heard about your interaction with Lawson in the yard." Keller tensed. "Nothing I can't handle." "I'm sure." Grayson took a bite, chewed thoroughly before continuing. "But let me be clear. If whatever game you're playing with Carter and his friends disrupts my prison, you'll find yourself working the night shift at the women's facility in Baton Rouge." "It's not a game," Keller protested. "These inmates are—" "I don't care," Grayson cut him off. "Nick, sort it out. And for God's sake, man up. You look like you've seen a ghost." The warden rose, leaving his half-eaten meal. As he walked away, Keller noticed several guards watching from other tables, quickly averting their eyes when he looked at them. Paranoia crept along Keller's spine like cold fingers. The end of shift couldn't come fast enough. Keller changed quickly in the locker room, avoiding looking at the scratched message, and headed for the staff parking lot. The night air was thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing in the trees beyond the perimeter fence. He fumbled with his keys, suddenly desperate to be away from Holt Penitentiary. "Leaving early, Keller?" He spun around to find CO Holloway approaching his own car 2 spaces down. "Shift's over," Keller replied tersely. Holloway hesitated, then said, "Listen, about today. I've been hearing things." Keller's pulse quickened. "What things?" "Just inmates talking about Carter, about you." Holloway seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "There's something building. I don't know what, but it feels different this time." "This time? What's that supposed to mean?" "You've hurt a lot of men in there, Keller. Broken a lot of spirits, but Carter—" Holloway shook his head. "You might have finally picked the wrong target." You threatening me? Keller took a step toward you. Him. Holloway held up his hands. Just telling you what I see. What everybody sees. He got into his car. Before closing the door, he added, "Watch your back." As Holloway drove away, Keller stood frozen in the parking lot. The cicadas seemed louder now, their droning taking on an ominous rhythm. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. He got into his truck and locked the doors immediately. His hand went to the glove compartment, fingers wrapping around the grip of his personal firearm, a .45 he rarely carried off duty. Tonight he slipped it into his jacket pocket before starting the engine. As he pulled away from Holt Penitentiary, Keller checked his rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see someone following him. The road back to his apartment had never seemed so dark, the shadows never so deep. For the first time in his 15 years as a corrections officer, Dwayne Keller was afraid to go to work tomorrow. Keller arrived at Holt Penitentiary an hour early the next morning, the weight of his personal firearm pressing against his ankle beneath his uniform pants. He'd barely slept, jumping at every creak in his apartment, checking locks twice. Then, 3 times. The drive to work had been a blur of paranoid glances in the rearview mirror. The early hour gave him time to inspect his locker thoroughly. The etched "tomorrow" remained, mocking him. He ran his fingers over the scratches, trying to imagine who could have accessed his locker, how they'd known his combination. Early. Bird gets the worm? Keller spun around, heart racing, to find Warden Grayson watching him with cool detachment. Just getting an early start, Keller managed, closing his locker door. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. I hope whatever's eating at you gets resolved quickly. I need my senior officers focused. Nothing's eating at me, Keller insisted. Just doing my job. See that you do. Grayson turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Keller? I hear you might be carrying unauthorized equipment today. I'd reconsider that decision if I were you. Before Keller could respond, the warden was gone, leaving him with the disturbing realization that even his personal precautions were somehow known. Had someone seen him loading the gun this morning? Or was there another explanation? One that suggested the warden himself might be involved in whatever was happening. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through him. If he couldn't trust Grayson, who could he trust? Telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. C-block morning count should have been routine. Inmates standing by their cells responding to their names with "Here, sir," or simply "Here." It was a ritual of control, a daily reminder of the power structure. Today, the responses came with unsettling uniformity. Every black inmate answered with exactly the same intonation, "Here." No "sir," no individual variations. Just that single word, spoken as if rehearsed. When he reached Carter's cell, Keller paused, waiting for the acknowledgement. Carter stood, at attention, his bruised face impassive. "Carter," Keller called, trying to keep his voice steady. A long pause stretched between them. Finally, Carter spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the silent block. "Almost here." Murmurs rippled through the tier. Keller felt his face flush with anger and something else. Fear. "What was that, inmate?" he demanded. Carter's face remained expressionless. "Here, sir." But the damage was done. The challenge had been issued publicly, however subtle. Worse, Keller had no idea what "almost here" meant, but the collective reaction of the inmates suggested they did. He continued the count, hyper-aware of eyes tracking his every move. As he finished and prepared to release the inmates for breakfast, he noticed Holloway watching him from the end of the tier, his expression troubled. "Everything all right, Keller?" Holloway asked as they supervised the inmates filing out. "Fine," Keller snapped. "Why wouldn't it be?" Holloway hesitated. "Look, I don't agree with a lot of what goes on here, but I'm not blind. Something's brewing. Maybe you should talk to the warden about taking some time off." "So you can slide?" "Into my position? Not happening." "This isn't about your job," Holloway insisted, keeping his voice low. "It's about—" "I know exactly what it's about," Keller cut him off. Carter thinks he can run a game on me. He can't. End of story. Holloway shook his head. It's bigger than Carter now. You really don't see it? See what exactly? The united front. The coordination. Holloway looked around nervously. I've worked other prisons. When inmates get disorganized, it never ends well. Keller wanted to dismiss Holloway's concerns, but the evidence was mounting. The silent signals. The uniform responses. The way every black inmate seemed to be operating with a single purpose. They're animals, Keller said, but the conviction was gone from his voice. What can they do? Holloway didn't answer. He just gave Keller a long look before walking away, leaving him alone with his growing dread. By mid-afternoon, Keller felt like he was drowning. Everywhere he turned, there were whispers that stopped when he approached. Inmates moved out of his path with exaggerated care, their eyes following him. Even the white inmates seemed to be keeping their distance, sensing a shift in the power structure. Desperate for some sense of normalcy, he sought out Ray Henshaw during the shift change. If anyone would stand with him, it would be Henshaw. They'd broken too many inmates together, shared too many racist jokes over beers after work. He found Henshaw in the staff break room, feet up on a table, flipping through a magazine. Ray, Keller said, dropping into the chair opposite him. We need to talk. Henshaw looked up, his expression guarded. About what? Don't play dumb. About whatever the hell is going on in this place, Carter, the messages, all of it. Setting down his magazine, Henshaw sighed. What exactly do you want me to say, Dwayne? That you've got my back, Keller said, hating how needy he sounded. That we're still on the same side. Henshaw studied him for a long moment. You know, I've always respected you. You understood what needs to be done to keep control in a place like this. The past tense wasn't lost on Keller. Understood? Past tense? Look at yourself, man. Henshaw gestured vaguely. You're jumping at shadows. Word is you brought a piece into the facility. You're sweating like you've got the flu. You think the inmates don't notice? You think they don't smell fear? I'm not afraid, Keller insisted, his hand instinctively moving toward his ankle. Sure you are. Henshaw leaned forward. And fear is a death sentence in here. You taught me that. The betrayal hit Keller like a physical blow. So that's it? You're cutting me loose because of some mind games from Carter? Henshaw stood, smoothing his uniform. I'm looking out for myself, same as you'd do. He paused at the door. You know what that symbol on my neck means? It means I belong to something bigger than just this job. Something that values strength. His eyes traveled down to where Keller's hand still hovered near his ankle. And purges weakness. With that he was gone, leaving Keller more isolated than ever. The afternoon dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Keller's nerves were frayed, his temper razor thin. He snapped at inmates for minor infractions, clutched his baton too tightly, rounded corners with his back to the wall. During the lunch rotation, he caught young Zay Moore staring at him from the chow line, a small smile playing on his lips. When their eyes met, Zay made a subtle tick-tock motion with his finger before turning away. The message was clear enough. Clock's ticking. By late afternoon, Keller felt like he was coming apart at the seams. He headed to the staff restroom, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him was a stranger, pale, haunted, diminished. As he dried his hands, he noticed something on the paper towel dispenser. Another message written in what looked like ballpoint pen. Clock's ticking. Keller ripped the paper towel from the dispenser, crumpled it, and shoved it deep into the trash. How were they doing this? It was as if they could read his mind, anticipate his movements, access any part of the facility at will. Unless they had help. The thought struck him like lightning. What if another guard was working with them? Or multiple guards? It would explain how they accessed his locker, how they knew about his gun, how they could leave messages in staff areas. His mind raced through possibilities. Holloway, with his uncomfortable questions and moral qualms? Henshaw with his mysterious tattoo and talk of something bigger or someone else entirely? Trust, already in short supply, evaporated completely. In the yard during afternoon recreation, Keller stationed himself in the corner with the best view of the entire space. No one would approach him unseen. No one would catch him off guard. The inmates continued their eerie coordination, moving in patterns that seemed random but weren't. Conversations conducted in hushed tones or with subtle hand gestures. Carter sat in the same spot as yesterday, still clearly in pain from his injuries but holding court nonetheless. Big T beside him, Zay hovering nearby. Keller's hand kept drifting to his ankle, reassured by the hard outline of the .45. If things went sideways, he'd at least have that. Movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Warden Grayson on the observation deck watching the yard with clinical detachment. Beside him stood Holloway, the two of them deep in conversation. About him, about Carter, about whatever storm was brewing. Paranoia surged. Everyone was against him. Everyone was in on it. Without conscious decision, Keller found himself marching across the yard toward Carter. He needed answers, needed to break through whatever game they were playing. Inmates parted. Before him, some smirking, others watching with blank expressions. By the time he reached Carter, a hush had fallen over the yard. "On your feet, inmate," Keller ordered, his voice cracking slightly. Carter looked up, his one good eye studying Keller's face. After a deliberate pause, he rose slowly, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Something I can help you with, Officer Keller?" Carter asked, his voice steady and controlled. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Keller hissed, stepping closer. "The messages, the whispers, you think you can break me?" Carter's expression remained neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." "Tomorrow," Keller spat. "Clock's ticking, dead men, ring any bells?" A small smile touched Carter's lips. "Sounds like you've got a lot on your mind, Officer Keller." Rage surged through Keller's veins. His hand shot out, grabbing the front of Carter's jumpsuit. "You listen to me, you piece of—" "Officer Keller." The sharp command came from behind. Him. Keller turned to find Warden Grayson striding across the yard, Holloway trailing behind. "Unhand that inmate. Now." Grayson's voice was like ice. Slowly, Keller released his grip on Carter's jumpsuit. The warden's appearance had drawn an even larger audience, inmates gathering to watch the confrontation while maintaining a cautious distance. "My office," Grayson ordered. "Immediately." As Keller turned to follow the warden, he caught sight of Big T and Zay, standing nearby. Big T drew a finger across his throat, an unmistakable gesture, while Zay mouthed those words again. "Clock's ticking." Warden Grayson's office was a testament to the man's clinical precision. Everything in its place, not a paper out of alignment. The desk clear, except for a single file folder. "Sit down," Grayson ordered, taking his own seat behind the desk. Keller remained standing. "Sir, I need to explain what's happening. Carter is orchestrating—" "I said sit," Grayson repeated, his voice dangerously soft. This time Keller complied, lowering himself into the hard-backed chair across from the warden. "I've been patient with you, Keller. I've overlooked your methods because they served a purpose. You kept order, and order keeps the money flowing." Grayson opened the file folder. "But now you're becoming a liability." "Sir, there's something happening with the inmates. Carter's behind it. They're sending messages, planning something." "Enough." Grayson cut him off. "Do you know what this is?" He tapped the open file. Keller squinted at the papers. "My personnel file." "Your transfer request." Grayson's thin smile held no warmth. "Effective tomorrow. You'll be working the night shift at Beaumont Minimum Security." "What?" Keller felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "You can't do that." "I just did." Grayson closed the file. "Consider it a mercy. Whatever's happening between you and Carter has escalated beyond your control. I'm removing you from the equation." "You're making a mistake," Keller insisted, desperation rising in his voice. "They're planning something big, a riot, maybe worse." Grayson studied him with cold eyes. What they're planning is irrelevant. What matters is that you've lost your edge. You're afraid, and fear makes you dangerous to my operation." The truth of it pierced Keller's defenses. He was afraid, terrified even. But not of Carter, not really. He was afraid of losing the only thing that gave his life meaning, the power he wielded at Holt. "One more shift," Grayson continued. "Then, you're done here, and Keller?" His eyes flicked to Keller's ankle. "If I find you're carrying unauthorized weaponry in my facility, your career ends today instead of tomorrow. Clear?" "Yes, sir," Keller managed, the final threads of his authority unraveling before his eyes. As he left the warden's office, he passed Holloway in the corridor. The younger guard's face showed conflict, sympathy warring with self-preservation. "I heard," Holloway said quietly. "Maybe it's for the best." "Easy for you to say," Keller muttered. "You're not the one they're targeting." Holloway shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. They're not targeting you, Keller. They're judging you. There's a difference." The words followed Keller like a shadow as he made his way to the administrative office to request a shift change. He couldn't face another night rotation, not with the cloud of tomorrow hanging over his head. One, last day shift. Then a transfer to a minimum security facility, where his methods, his power would be useless, where he would be nothing. The form for shift reassignment sat before him, the pen heavy in his hand. As he signed his name, he noticed graffiti scratched into the desk's surface hidden under the edge of the form. "It won't save you." Keller dropped the pen as if it had burned him. They were everywhere. They knew everything. And tomorrow was coming. Sleep never came for Keller that night. He sat in his apartment, blinds drawn, pistol on the coffee table, whiskey bottle half empty beside it. The darkness felt alive with threats. Every distant siren made him flinch. Every creak of the building sent his hand to the gun. Morning brought no relief, only the dull realization that this was his last day at Holt Penitentiary, his last chance to reassert control, to prove he wasn't afraid, to show Carter and the others that he was still the one with power. He arrived early again, his eyes bloodshot, hands trembling slightly from lack of sleep and too much whiskey. In the locker room, he hesitated before opening his locker, bracing himself for another message. But the metal door revealed only the original etching. Tomorrow. Today was his tomorrow. Transfer day. The day they'd won. No, he wasn't beaten yet. The 45 remained at home. He couldn't risk Grayson following through on his threat. But Keller had his nightstick, his pepper spray, his fists. Weapons enough to remind the inmates who was still in charge for one more day at least. Morning count went smoothly, too smoothly. The eerie uniformity of responses continued, but there was something new in the air. Anticipation. The inmates moved with barely contained energy, like predators, before a hunt. Carter stood at attention in his cell, bruises darkening to a sickly yellow-purple split lip healing. When Keller called his name, he responded with a simple, "Here," but his eyes held something that made Keller's skin crawl. Knowledge, certainty. "What are you planning, Carter?" Keller asked, keeping his voice low. Carter just blinked, his expression unchanging. "Planning, sir? I'm just serving my time." "Cut the innocent act. I know you're behind all this." A small smile touched Carter's lips. "Behind what exactly?" The calm question pushed Keller to the edge. His hand tightened on his nightstick, knuckles white. "You think you've won something?" "You haven't. You're still the one in the cage." "For now," Carter replied simply. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Keller felt a surge of rage mixed with fear, a dangerous cocktail. Without thinking, he slammed his nightstick against the bars. "I could end you right now," he hissed. "One report about you, threatening an officer. One incident during transport." Carter's expression didn't change. "We both know it's too late for that." Before Keller could respond, he noticed Holloway approaching down the tier, eyes narrowed in concern. Keller stepped back from Carter's cell, composing his face into a mask of professional indifference. "Everything all right here?" Holloway asked, looking between them. "Just finishing count," Keller said tersely, moving to the next cell. Holloway fell into step beside him. "Warden wants to see you after release for breakfast. Something about processing your transfer paperwork." The reminder scraped against Keller's already raw nerves. "I know the procedure." "Just doing my job," Holloway replied, his voice neutral. "Same as you." But it wasn't the same. Not anymore. Keller's job had been maintaining order through fear. Now the fear was his, and everyone knew it. The mess hall during breakfast was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Black inmates sat in tight groups, conversations hushed, attention divided between their food and the guards stationed around the perimeter. White inmates kept to themselves, sensing the tension but unclear on its source. The Latinos watched, everything waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Keller stood near the serving line, baton in hand, eyes constantly scanning for threats. Carter sat with Big T and Zay, occasionally receiving visitors from other tables. Quick conversations, subtle handshakes, nods of acknowledgement, a council of war. Across the room, a young black inmate, new to the facility, barely 20, dropped his tray with a clatter. The noise cut through the low murmur of conversation like a gunshot. Without thinking, Keller rushed over, nightstick raised. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, towering over the smaller man. The inmate looked up, startled. "Sorry, sir, it was an accident." "An accident?" Keller's voice rose, drawing attention from surrounding tables. "Or a signal?" Confusion crossed the young man's face. A signal for what? Something in the innocent question pushed Keller over the edge. Weeks of fear, paranoia, and humiliation erupted in a single moment of blind rage. His nightstick swung down, catching the inmate on the shoulder, driving him to his knees. "Keller!" Holloway's shout cut through the sudden silence of the mess hall. "Stand down!" But Keller was beyond reason. He grabbed the inmate by the collar, yanking him up. "What are you planning? What does tomorrow mean? Tell me." The mess hall erupted. Black inmates rose to their feet, trays forgotten. White inmates backed away from tables. Guards moved in, batons ready. Holloway reached Keller, grabbing his arm. "That's enough. Let him go." Keller shoved Holloway away, his focus entirely on the frightened young inmate. "Tell me what Carter's planning." "I don't know what you're talking about," the inmate gasped, blood trickling from a split lip. From across the room, Carter's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Let him go, Keller. He's not part of this." The admission that there was something to be part of snapped Keller's attention to Carter. In that moment of distraction, Holloway and another guard pulled him away from the young inmate. "Take him to the infirmary," Holloway ordered the other guard, who led the shaken young man away. To Keller he hissed, "The warden's office, now." As Keller was escorted out, he caught Carter's eye across the mess hall. For once, the inscrutable man's expression was clear. Satisfaction. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Warden Grayson's voice was dangerously quiet, his thin frame rigid with contained fury. "Assaulting an inmate in full view of the entire mess hall? Today of all days?" Keller stood before the warden's desk, still breathing hard. That inmate, Grayson cut him off, was serving 6 months for low-level drug possession. A first-timer, no gang affiliations, no connection to Carter or anyone else in C Block. The information hit Keller like cold water. Had he been wrong? Had his paranoia pushed him to attack an innocent kid? "Sir, I know how it looks, but something is happening in this prison. Carter is orchestrating." "Enough!" Grayson slammed his hand on the desk. "I've heard enough of your conspiracy theories. The only thing happening in this prison is you coming apart at the seams." He took a deep breath, visibly collecting himself. "I'm expediting your transfer. You're done here now." "But sir, this isn't a discussion, Keller. It's an order. Clear out your locker and leave the facility. Your replacement will take over. Your duties effective immediately." "So that's it?" Keller's voice cracked. 15 years and you're throwing me away like garbage because of Carter?" Grayson's cold eyes assessed him. I'm removing you because you've become a liability. What happens after you leave isn't my concern. You'll regret this, Keller said, desperation giving way to anger. When whatever they're planning happens, you'll wish I was still here. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Grayson's face. You really believe something's coming, don't you? I know it is. Keller leaned forward, hands on Grayson's desk. Let me put Carter in solitary. Let me break up his network before it's too late. Grayson considered for a moment, then shook his head. No. Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, moving against Carter now would only accelerate whatever's brewing. He stood, indicating the meeting was over. Go home, Keller. Your career at Holt is finished. The locker room was empty as Keller cleared his personal items, stuffing them haphazardly into a duffel bag. Each item represented a piece of his identity being stripped away, photos of hunting trips with fellow guards, a coffee mug with the Holt insignia, a commendation letter from his early years. 15 years of his life, ended by a single word etched into metal: tomorrow. As he slammed the locker shut for the final time, the door to the locker room opened. Ray Henshaw stepped in, his face unreadable. Come to gloat? Keller asked bitterly. Henshaw shook his head. Just came to say goodbye. And to give you some advice. I don't need advice from a traitor. Call it what you want. Henshaw leaned against the lockers. But listen anyway. Get as far from Holt as you can. Today. Don't look back. A chill ran through Keller. So there is something planned. Henshaw's expression remained neutral. I'm just saying the winds are changing. Smart. Rats know when to abandon ship. And that's what you are? A rat? I'm a survivor. Henshaw pushed off from the lockers. Something you used to be. As he turned to leave, Keller called after him. What's happening tonight, Ray? Henshaw paused at the door. Tomorrow. The kakir word hung in the air between them. Then he was gone. Keller sat in his truck in the staff parking lot, engine running, unable to leave. The afternoon sun beat down on the metal roof, turning the cab into an oven, but he barely noticed. His mind raced with possibilities, with fears, with a desperate need to know what was coming. The rational part of him knew he should drive away, put Holt Penitentiary in his rearview mirror forever. But 15 years of authority, of control, of being someone who mattered, couldn't be abandoned so easily. Decision made, he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the administration office. When the clerk answered, he disguised his voice slightly. This is Deputy Warden Phillips. I need CO Keller held for questioning regarding an incident this morning. He's to wait in interview room B until I arrive. The lie flowed easily. Deputy Warden Phillips was on vacation, a fact the day clerk might not know. Yes, sir, came the uncertain reply. Should I notify Warden Grayson? I've already spoken with the warden. Just make sure Keller doesn't leave the facility. Hanging up, Keller smiled grimly. He'd bought himself time. Now he needed a way back into the secure area without being spotted by Grayson or Holloway. The answer came in the form of a food delivery truck pulling up to the service entrance. Kitchen deliveries meant temporary disruption of the normal security protocols. A window of opportunity. Keller waited until the delivery workers were busy unloading pallets, then slipped through the service entrance, badge ready if anyone questioned. Once inside, he moved quickly through the administrative corridors, avoiding the main hallways where he might be spotted. His destination was clear, the guard station overlooking C Block. From there, he could monitor Carter, maybe intercept whatever was being planned. If he could catch Carter in the act of organizing something, even Grayson would have to admit he'd been right all along. Night fell over Holt Penitentiary, the facility shifting into its evening routine. Dinner service ended. Inmates returned to their cells for count. Recreation rooms emptied. Guards changed shifts. From his vantage point in a rarely used observation booth above C Block, Keller watched it all, searching for patterns, for signals, for anything out of the ordinary. He'd disabled the booth's light to remain hidden in the shadows, relying on the illumination from the block below. Carter's cell was directly in his line of sight. The man sat on his bunk reading a worn paperback, the picture of calm. Occasionally, other inmates would pause at his cell during movement periods, exchanging brief words before moving on. Nothing suspicious. Nothing actionable. Just the normal rhythm of prison life. As lights out approached, Keller's certainty began to waver. Had it all been in his head? The coordinated responses, the messages, Big T's threats, had he manufactured a conspiracy where none existed? Maybe the warden was right. Maybe he had lost his edge, his nerve. Maybe... A sudden movement caught his eye. In the dimness of his cell, Carter closed his book and stood. He moved to the bars, hands gripping the metal, eyes turned upward, directly at Keller's hiding place. A slow smile spread across Carter's battered face as he stared into the darkness where Keller sat frozen. He couldn't possibly see Keller. The booth was dark, the angle wrong, and yet somehow he knew. Carter raised one hand in a small wave, then turned back to his bunk just as the lights began shutting down for the night. Keller's breath came in short gasps. They knew he was here. They'd known all along. The first wisps of smoke were so faint he thought he'd imagined them, tendrils of gray curling up from the guard station at the end of the tier. Then came a flicker of orange, small at first, then growing rapidly. Fire. The alarm blared an instant later, its wailing cutting through the darkness. Emergency lights flashed on, bathing the block in harsh, intermittent red illumination. Guards rushed to the source of the fire, shouting orders, calling for backup. Below, cell doors remained locked. Inmates stood at their bars, watching, waiting. None called out in panic. None seemed surprised. They'd expected this. The fire grew quickly, consuming papers, then furniture. Black smoke billowed toward the ceiling. Guards tried to contain it with extinguishers, but the blaze had been carefully planned for maximum effect. Positioned near oxygen tanks used for medical emergencies, ensuring it would spread rapidly. Through the observation window, Keller watched, in horror as the situation deteriorated. The smoke was too thick now, forcing guards to retreat. Radio calls for backup echoed through the block. The decision came quickly. Evacuate the block, get the inmates out before the smoke overcame them. Emergency protocols activated. Cell doors began opening automatically, a safety feature designed to prevent inmates from being trapped in case of fire. Including Carter's door. The man stepped out calmly, unhurried. In the strobing red light, his face looked demonic, shadow and light playing across his features. He turned, looking directly at Keller's hiding place again, and nodded once. Then, chaos erupted. The fire had been a diversion. As guards focused on evacuation procedures, fights broke out simultaneously at multiple points in the block. Not random violence, targeted, coordinated attacks that separated the guards, isolated them. Keller watched, paralyzed as the careful organization revealed itself. Black inmates moved with military precision, creating barriers, cutting off escape routes. Within minutes, the guards were outnumbered, surrounded, overwhelmed. Over the radio, calls for assistance from other blocks went unanswered. Then came the reason. Fires had broken out in multiple locations throughout the prison. This wasn't just a C-block rebellion, it was facility-wide. Trapped in his observation booth, Keller finally understood. Tomorrow wasn't just a threat. It wasn't just a mind game. Tomorrow was now, and he was trapped inside Holt Penitentiary with the very men he had brutalized for years. With shaking hands, he drew his concealed firearm, checked the magazine. But rounds. Not enough. Not nearly enough. He wedged a chair against the door handle, barricading himself in the small booth. His radio crackled with desperate calls for help, with reports of inmates seizing control of entire blocks, with the sounds of a prison falling. And through the glass he could see Carter looking up at him, waiting patiently as the world burned around them. The observation booth offered Keller a front row seat to his worst nightmare. Through the reinforced glass window, He watched C Block descend into controlled chaos. Fires burned at strategic points, limiting movement and visibility. Black smoke curled toward the ceiling, activating sprinklers that turned the concrete floors into treacherous surfaces. In the strobing emergency lights and falling water, figures moved with purpose. Not random violence, but methodical execution of what was clearly a well-developed plan. Injured guards were being dragged to cells, locked inside, a reversal that turned Keller's stomach. The few who resisted were beaten into submission, though notably no one was killed. This wasn't a bloodbath, not yet. His radio crackled with fragmented reports from around the facility. D Block completely overrun, requesting immediate backup in admin. Lockdown protocols failing. Where the hell is SORT? The Special Operations Response Team, Holt's riot squad, should have deployed by now. Their absence confirmed Keller's growing suspicion. This uprising was more extensive than he could have imagined. Someone had compromised the facility's emergency response. A sudden pounding on the observation booth door nearly stopped his heart. "Keller, I know you're in there." Holloway's voice. Keller hesitated, gun trained on the door. "Open up, man. We need to move now." Keller shifted the chair blocking the door. "How do I know you're not with them?" "Are you serious?" Holloway's voice cracked with desperation. "They're executing a facility-wide takeover and you think I'm part of it? Open the damn door before they find us both." Reason overcame paranoia. Keller removed the chair and cracked the door, gun still raised. Holloway stood alone, uniform torn, face streaked with soot, a makeshift baton in his hands. "Jesus," Holloway breathed, seeing the gun. "Put that away before you get us killed. One shot, and every inmate in this block will be on us." Keller lowered the weapon but didn't holster it. "What's happening?" "What's happening is you were right," Holloway admitted, pushing into the small booth and closing the door behind him. "Carter, his crew, they planned this for months, coordinated across all blocks. They've seized the central control room, disabled most of the security systems." "Where's the warden?" "Barricaded in his office with some of the administrative staff. SORT can't get in. Inmates have blocked all the main entrances." Holloway wiped sweat from his forehead. "How the hell did you know something was coming?" Keller shook his head. "I didn't know this. Not something this big." He moved to the window, looking down at the organized chaos below. "Where's Henshaw?" Holloway's expression darkened. "Gone, along with about a dozen other guards. They just walked out when it started." The tattoo on Henshaw's neck flashed in Keller's memory. The talk of belonging to something bigger. They were in on it. Maybe, or maybe they just knew to get out. Holloway joined him at the window. "We need to do the same. There's a maintenance corridor behind the kitchen that leads to the outer fence. If we can reach it." Movement below caught Keller's attention. Carter stood in the center of the block, surrounded by a group of inmates including Big T and Zay. They were gathered around something on the floor, a bundle of white fabric. "What are they doing?" Keller muttered. Holloway squinted through the smoky air. "Is that... Jesus, they've got guard uniforms." As they watched, inmates began donning the stolen uniforms, transforming themselves into reasonable facsimiles of corrections officers. Carter directed the operation with quiet authority, pointing to different areas of the block, clearly assigning positions. "It's a takeover," Keller realized aloud. "Not just a riot. They're replacing us." "All the more reason to get out now," Holloway urged. "Come on." But Keller couldn't tear himself away from the window. Below, Carter suddenly looked up, his gaze locking directly on the observation booth. A slow smile spread across his face. "He knows we're here," Keller whispered. Carter raised a hand, pointing directly at them, then made a beckoning gesture. At his signal, several inmates moved toward the stairwell that led to the observation level. "We need to move now." Holloway tugged at Keller's arm. "They're coming for us." This time, Keller didn't resist. They slipped out of the booth and hurried down the narrow corridor that ran along the top of the cell block. Behind them, they could hear footsteps on the metal stairs. Multiple pursuers, not bothering to conceal their approach. "This way," Holloway hissed, leading them toward an emergency exit that connected to the administrative wing. He pushed against the bar, but the door didn't budge. Shit, they've blocked it from the other side. Keller spun around, assessing their options. The corridor stretched back the way they'd come, with the observation booth in the middle and another emergency exit at the far end. If that one was also blocked, we're trapped, he realized aloud. The footsteps grew louder. Voices now, calling to each other as they coordinated their search. "In here," Holloway whispered, trying the door to a storage closet. It opened, revealing a small space filled with cleaning supplies. "It's our only chance." They squeezed inside, closing the door just as the first inmates reached the top of the stairs. Through the thin door, they could hear multiple sets of footsteps moving along the corridor, checking rooms, methodically searching. Come out, wherever you are," sang a voice Keller recognized as Zay's. "We know you're up here, Keller. Carter wants to have a word with you." Keller's hand tightened on his gun. Beside him in the darkness, Holloway tensed. "Don't," Holloway whispered, barely audible. "They'll kill us both." The footsteps paused. Outside their hiding place, Keller held his breath, finger hovering near the trigger. If that door opened, "Check the booth again," came another voice. Big T's. "And the exit doors. They might have found a way through." The footsteps moved away. Keller exhaled slowly, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would give them away. "We need to wait them out," Holloway whispered. "State police will respond eventually. National Guard, maybe. And how long will that take?" Keller hissed back. "Hours? Days? They'll find us before then." "You got a better idea?" Keller didn't. Trapped in a storage closet, hunted by men who had every reason to want him dead, his options had dwindled to nothing. For the first time in his career, he was the powerless one, the prey, not the predator. They waited in tense silence as the search continued. Minutes stretched like hours in the cramped darkness. Outside, the sounds of the riot intensified. Shouts, crashes, occasional screams. The prison was being torn apart piece by piece, and they were at the mercy of whatever. New order emerged. Suddenly, the door was yanked open. Light flooded the closet, blinding them momentarily. Keller raised his gun, but a powerful hand grabbed his wrist, twisting until the weapon clattered to the floor. Big T stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking any escape. Behind him, Zay grinned widely, a stolen guard's baton twirling in his hand. Two other inmates flanked them, both wearing pieces of guard uniforms. "Look what we found," Big T rumbled, his grip on Keller's wrist tightening, painfully. Two little piggies hiding from the big bad wolf. Holloway lunged forward, trying to push past them, but Zay's baton connected with his stomach, doubling him over. Zay admonished. "Where you think you're going? Party's just getting started." Keller struggled against Big T's grip, but the larger man simply increased the pressure until Keller felt bones grinding together. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Big T advised, his voice deceptively gentle. "Carter's waiting." They were dragged from the closet and marched back down the corridor, Keller's gun now tucked into Zay's waistband. At the stairs, they were shoved forward, nearly losing their balance on the steep metal steps. The scene that greeted them at the bottom was surreal. C-Block had been transformed in the short time since they'd hidden. The fires were contained, now the smoke thinning. Inmates moved with purpose, cleaning up debris, organizing supplies, establishing a new order. Some wore partial guard uniforms, a symbolic claiming of authority. In the center of it all stood Carter, supervising the operation with quiet commands. When he saw Keller and Holloway being brought down the stairs, he paused, his expression unreadable. "Bring them," he said simply. They were marched to the middle of the block, where a small circle had formed, a makeshift court with Carter at its head. Other inmates gathered around, their faces solemn, expectant. "Officer Holloway," Carter addressed the younger guard first. "You're new here. Your hands are relatively clean. That why you were helping him?" He nodded toward Keller. Holloway stood, straight, meeting Carter's gaze. "I was doing my job." Your job, Carter repeated, considering the words. Your job was to look the other way while men like Keller tortured inmates? While they staged fights, planted contraband, denied medical care? I never participated in any of that, Holloway protested. But you knew, and you said nothing. Carter's voice remained calm but carried an edge of steel. That makes you complicit. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered inmates. Holloway's face paled. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice barely steady. Carter studied him for a long moment. Lock him in cell 18, he finally ordered. We'll decide his fate later. Two inmates stepped forward, taking Holloway by the arms. He didn't resist as they led him away, his eyes fixed on Keller with a mixture of accusation and fear. Then it was just Keller, standing alone before the man he'd brutalized for years. The power differential couldn't have been more stark. Carter, surrounded by allies in control of the block, while Keller stood weaponless, abandoned at the mercy of his former victims. Dwayne Keller, Carter said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent block. Do you know why you're here? Keller's throat was dry, his voice hoarse when he managed to speak. Because you've been planning this. All the messages, the mind games, it was leading to this. The messages were just a bonus, Carter replied with a small smile. A way to watch you unravel, to let you feel what it's like to be powerless, to be afraid. Around them, inmates nodded, some with grim satisfaction, others with barely contained rage. You remember what you did? Carter asked, his voice softening dangerously. Not just to me, to all of us. Memories flooded Keller's mind, years of casual cruelty, of orchestrated humiliations, of violence justified as maintaining order. Faces blurred together, countless men he'd beaten, threatened, broken. All for what? To feel powerful? To prove something to himself? I was doing my job, he echoed Holloway's words, knowing how hollow they sounded. A harsh laugh escaped Big T. Your job? Your job was to keep order, not to torture people for sport. You enjoyed it, Zay added, stepping forward. I saw your face when they were beating D'Lo. You were smiling. Keller had no answer for that. It was true. Carter raised a hand, silencing the growing murmurs. The difference between us, Keller, is that I don't enjoy suffering. Not even yours. He stepped closer until they were face to face. You beat me, had me jumped, left me for dead. And you know what scares you most about me? That I never broke. That I never became the animal you wanted me to be. The truth of it hit Keller like a physical blow. Carter's resilience had always unsettled him, the quiet dignity that no amount of brutality could erase. What are you going to do? Keller asked, unconsciously echoing Holloway's question. Carter's eyes were cold, evaluating. That depends on you, on whether you can face what you've done, on whether there's anything human left inside you. From somewhere in the facility, an explosion rocked the building, distant but powerful enough to be felt even in C Block. The sound of renewed fighting echoed through the corridors. Sounds like your people are finally mounting a counterattack, Carter observed calmly. Too little, too late. We control most of the facility now. As if to emphasize his point, the radio on Big T's belt, stolen from a guard, crackled to life. C Block, this is D Block. White supremacists trying to push through from the workshop. Need backup. Big T raised the radio. On our way. To Carter, he said, we need to deal with this. Carter nodded. Take who you need. I'll finish here. As Big T organized a group to respond to the threat, Keller saw his opportunity. A moment of distraction, of divided attention. Without conscious thought, he lunged forward, driving his shoulder into Carter's midsection. The injured man staggered back but didn't fall. Before Keller could press his advantage, hands grabbed him from behind, pulling him away. He fought wildly, desperately, but was quickly overwhelmed by multiple attackers. A punch to his kidney dropped him to his knees. Another to his jaw sent him sprawling on the concrete floor. Through a haze of pain, he looked up to see Carter waving the attackers back. Enough, Carter ordered. "He's not worth it." The restraint only fueled Keller's rage and desperation. "Just kill me and get it over with," he spat, blood dripping from his split lip. Carter looked down at him, something like pity in his expression. "That would be too easy, for both of us." He gestured to two inmates. "Take him to the shower block, secure him there." To Keller, he added, "We'll continue our conversation when I get back, after I deal with your white power friends." As they dragged Keller away, he saw the hierarchy of Holt Penitentiary fully inverted. Carter moved with the authority of a warden, directing operations with calm efficiency. Inmates responded to his orders without question. Even the clash between racial groups played out according to his design. Contained, directed, purposeful. The prison had a new master. And Dwayne Keller, once the embodiment of power within these walls, had been reduced to just another body to be locked away and forgotten. They threw him into the shower block, securing the heavy door with a stolen guard's keys. Through the small, reinforced window, he could see inmates moving through the corridors, some heading toward the workshop to confront the white supremacist push, others maintaining order in the block. Keller tried the door anyway, rattling it uselessly. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Tomorrow had come, just as they'd promised. And Dwayne Keller's reckoning was only beginning. The shower block smelled of mildew and bleach. Water dripped from leaking pipes overhead, each drop echoing in the tiled space like a ticking clock. Keller sat on a bench bolted to the wall, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. His body ached from the beating he'd received. Blood had dried in a crust along his jaw. One eye was swelling shut. His ribs protested with each breath. A familiar pain, but one he was accustomed to inflicting, not receiving. Time passed with agonizing slowness. Through the small window in the door, he could see occasional movement. Inmates passing by, some in partial guard uniforms, others in their standard jumpsuits. The sounds of the riot continued, but more distant now, concentrated in other parts of the facility. Carter's control of C Block appeared complete. The fires were out. The debris cleared. A new order established with remarkable efficiency. Keller had underestimated him. Had underestimated all of them. The sound of the lock turning snapped him to attention. He stood, fists clenched, prepared to fight despite the futility. The door swung open to reveal Zay, flanked by two other inmates he recognized from C Block. All three wore pieces of guard uniforms, a symbolic claiming of authority. "Boss wants to see you," Zay announced, twirling Keller's own gun casually. "Time for your tour." "Tour of what?" Keller asked, voice raspy. Zay's smile was cold. "Your legacy." They surrounded him, leaving no opportunity for resistance or escape. One grabbed his arm, twisting it painfully behind his back, a hold Keller himself had taught the guards to use. The irony wasn't lost on him. They marched him out of the shower block and down the corridor, past cells where guards now sat confined, roles reversed in a matter of hours. Some looked up as he passed, their expressions ranging from fear to grim resignation. None called out, to him. None offered support. He was on his own. "Where's Holloway?" Keller asked as they approached the administrative wing. "Safe," Zay replied shortly, "which is more than you deserve." They pushed through double doors into a section of the prison that was unrecognizable. Walls were scorched from fires that had raged and been extinguished. Papers and broken equipment littered the floor. Water from sprinklers had pooled in corners, mixed with ash to create a black sludge. The air still held the acrid tang of smoke. "Welcome to Holt Penitentiary post-liberation," Zay announced, gesturing at the destruction. "Pretty, ain't it?" The security checkpoint that had once separated the administrative area from the cell blocks had been completely destroyed. Its bulletproof glass shattered, metal detectors toppled, computer systems smashed. How? Keller couldn't stop the question. "How did you coordinate all this?" Zay just laughed. "Wouldn't you like to know?" After a pause, he added, "Let's just say some of your fellow COs weren't as loyal as you thought. Money talks, and some of your boys were real good listeners." Henshaw's face flashed in Keller's mind along with that mysterious tattoo. Had he been part of this all along? Had others? They continued through the ruined administrative section, past offices that had been ransacked, filing cabinets emptied, computers destroyed. It wasn't random vandalism. They'd been looking for specific information. Evidence, perhaps. Records of abuse. Names of corrupt officials. At the warden's office, they paused. The door hung from a single hinge, the wood splintered around the tew, lock where it had been forced open. Inside, the elegant furniture was overturned, the walls stripped of their framed certificates and commendations. A figure stood by the window, silhouetted against the emergency lights that still pulsed outside. Warden Grayson turned as they entered, his normally immaculate appearance in disarray. His silver hair was disheveled, his shirt torn, a bruise darkening on his cheekbone. "Look who it is," Grayson said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "The man who started all this." "I told you something was coming," Keller replied. "You didn't listen." "Oh, I listened," Grayson snapped. "I just didn't know you'd pushed them this far." He gestured to the destruction around them. "This is your legacy, Keller. Years of your sadistic games, your racism, your brutality, all coming back to haunt us." "Don't act innocent," Keller shot back. "You knew what was happening. You approved it as long as it kept your operation running smoothly." Grayson's thin face twisted. "And now we're both paying the price." "Ain't that touching?" Zay interrupted. "Two pigs bonding over their shared failure." He shoved Keller forward. "Keep moving, you got more to see." Grayson watched them go, his eyes hollow with defeat. The once powerful warden, reduced to a prisoner in his own facility, was a stark reminder of how completely the power structure had collapsed. They led Keller through more corridors, each showing evidence of the coordinated assault that had overwhelmed the prison's defenses. The further they went, the more he saw the extent of the planning, the precision of the execution. This wasn't some spontaneous uprising. This was a revolution years in the making. "Where are we going?" Keller asked as they approached a familiar corridor. "Memory lane," Zay replied cryptically. They turned a corner and Keller's blood ran cold. He knew this hallway, knew the unmarked door at the end. The room beyond it had never appeared in any official prison documentation, was never mentioned in staff meetings. It existed in a gray area, acknowledged only by those who used it. The place where problematic inmates disappeared for special counseling. "No," Keller said, trying to pull back. "No, not there." Zay's grip tightened painfully. "What's wrong, Keller? Don't want to revisit your workspace?" They forced him forward, ignoring his resistance. The door was already open, light spilling into the corridor. Inside, the small room looked much as he remembered it. Bare concrete walls, a drain in the center of the floor, a single metal chair bolted down. No windows, no cameras, nothing to record what happened there. Except that now, the walls were lined with inmates, men Keller recognized, men who had passed through this room during his tenure, men who had carried the invisible scars of what happened here. And seated in the metal chair, calm and composed, was DeShawn Carter. "Officer Keller," Carter said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Welcome back." Zay and the others pushed Keller into the center of the room, directly over the drain that had served its grim purpose so many times. Rust-colored, stains marked the concrete, permanent reminders of the room's history. "You remember this place?" Carter asked, gesturing around them. "You should. You spent a lot of time here." Keller's mouth was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do you want from me?" "Want?" Carter tilted his head slightly. "I don't want anything from you. This isn't about what I want." He stood, moving with the careful precision of someone still healing from significant injuries. "This is about what you need." "And what's that?" Keller asked, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. "Understanding," Carter replied simply. "You've spent 15 years treating us like animals, like things. Now you need to understand what that means, what it feels like, what it costs." He nodded to Zay, who produced a familiar object from his pocket, a small digital recorder, the same model Keller had often used in this very room. "We found your trophies," Carter explained as Zay held up the device. All those recordings you kept, all those sessions you documented for your own amusement. Cold dread washed over Keller. The recordings had been his secret, stored in a locked drawer in his apartment, never shared, never mentioned. His private collection of power demonstrated, of control asserted, of men broken. How did you? You'd be surprised what people will do for money, Carter cut him off, or for justice. He gestured to Zay, who pressed play on the recorder. Keller's own voice filled the small room, echoing off the concrete walls. Let's try again. Who's moving the contraband through D block? A gasping voice responded, barely audible. I don't know. I swear. The unmistakable sound of a fist connecting with flesh. A cry of pain. Wrong answer. Let's see if we can jog your memory. Keller closed his eyes, unable to watch the faces of the men around him as they listened to his handiwork. The recording continued, documenting a session that had lasted nearly an hour. His voice remained calm throughout, almost casual, while the inmates' responses deteriorated into incoherent pleas. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was deafening. That was James Williams, Carter said quietly. Remember him? 23 years old, in for nonviolent drug possession. After your counseling, he tried to hang himself in his cell. Spent 3 months in the psychiatric unit. Keller remembered. Vaguely. There had been so many. That's just one recording, Carter continued. We found dozens. Different voices, different questions, same methods. He stepped closer. You're a sadist, Keller, but you already knew that. What do you want me to say? Keller asked, his voice hollow. That I'm sorry? That I regret it? Would you believe me if I did? No, Carter replied honestly. But this isn't about your regret. It's about their recognition. He gestured to the men lining the walls. For years you had the power to make them invisible, to hurt them with no consequences. Now they have the power to be seen, to be heard, to make you face what you did. One by one the men stepped forward. Some spoke of beatings, others of humiliation, of racial slurs, of denied medical care, of planted contraband that extended sentences. Each account more damning than the last, building a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse spanning years. Keller stood rooted to the spot, unable to escape, unable to deny. The weight of it all, the collective pain he'd inflicted, the lives he'd damaged, pressed down on him like a physical force. Stop, he finally said, his voice breaking. I get it. I'm the monster. I'm the animal. What now? You kill me? Torture me like I tortured you? What's the end game here? Carter studied him, his expression unreadable. That's the question, isn't it? What kind of justice serves the greatest good? What kind of leaders do we want to be? He looked around at the gathered men. I could give you to them. Let them do to you what you did to them. It would be fair by any measure. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Several men stepped forward, eager to take Carter up on the offer. But then, Carter continued, raising a hand to quiet them, we become you, and that's a price too high to pay. The room fell silent again, tension crackling in the air. Keller hardly dared breathe, caught between fear and a strange, unexpected sense of, what? Not relief. Not yet. But something close to wonder at Carter's restraint. He doesn't deserve mercy, Zay protested, gesturing at Keller with the gun. After what he did to you? To all of us? This isn't about what he deserves, Carter replied evenly. It's about who we choose to be. He turned back to Keller. But make no mistake, there will be justice. Just not the kind you understand. Before Keller could respond, the unmistakable sound of gunfire erupted somewhere in the facility. Closer than before, more sustained. Automatic weapons, the dull thump of concussion grenades. Tactical teams, Keller said, a flicker of hope rising in his chest. They're coming in. Carter remained unmoved. Yes, and they'll retake the prison eventually, but not before we finish what we started. To Zay, he said, "Take him to the yard. Let him see the rest." As they dragged him from the room, past the silent witnesses to his crimes, Keller felt something shift inside him, the last of his arrogance crumbling away, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of the man he'd thought he was. The prison was burning around them, literally and figuratively. The old order collapsing, the new order not yet fully formed, and Dwayne Keller, caught between worlds, had nowhere left to run. Not from his pursuers, and not from the truth of what he'd done. They emerged into the yard under a sky turned orange with distant fires. The night air carried the acrid smell of smoke, tear gas, and burning rubber. Floodlights cut through darkness, creating harsh pools of illumination where shadows danced, like restless spirits. The perimeter fence was barely visible through a haze of smoke, but Keller could make out movement beyond it, the gathering forces of tactical teams preparing for a full assault on the prison. The yard itself had been transformed into something between a war zone and a gathering place. Inmates moved with purpose, some reinforcing barricades, others tending to the injured. Black, white, and Latino prisoners worked alongside each other, the usual racial divisions temporarily suspended in the face of a common enemy. At the center of the yard stood a makeshift platform constructed from overturned tables. A flag had been raised, not a gang symbol or racial identifier, but a simple, white sheet with a single word painted in black: human. "Welcome to the endgame," Zay said, shoving Keller forward. As they approached the platform, Keller spotted familiar faces. Holloway sat on an overturned crate, his uniform torn and dirty, a guard watching over him. Their eyes met briefly before Holloway looked away, unable or unwilling to hold his gaze. Big T stood on the platform speaking to a group of inmates gathered around him. When he spotted Keller, he broke off mid-sentence, a grim smile spreading across his face. "The man of the hour," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard, just in time for the finale. Conversations quieted as inmates turned to look. Keller felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, men he'd tormented, men he'd ignored, men whose humanity he'd denied for years. Carter emerged from a group near the barricades, his movement still showing the pain of his injuries. He climbed onto the platform with deliberate care, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Officer Keller has seen what his legacy looks like." Carter addressed the gathered inmates, his voice strong despite his battered appearance. "He's faced the men he tortured. He's heard their stories. He's walked through the destruction his actions helped create." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some called for blood, for revenge. Others remained silent, watching Carter with expressions that ranged from respect to uncertainty. "Some of you want to hurt him," Carter continued, acknowledging the sentiment. "To make him suffer like we suffered. I understand that desire. I felt it myself, lying in the infirmary with broken ribs, wondering if this time he'd finally gone too far." He paused, looking down at Keller with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to the bone. "But there's something I've learned during my 15 years inside these walls. Something Keller never understood." Carter gestured around them at the burning prison, the gathered inmates, the flag fluttering above them. "Power isn't about who can inflict the most pain. It's about who retains their humanity when everything is designed to strip it away." The yard had fallen completely silent now, every ear straining to catch Carter's words. Keller thought he could break me by having me beaten, by humiliating me, by treating me like an animal. Carter shook his head slowly. But he failed. And he failed because he never understood that true power comes from within, from knowing who you are when everything else is taken away. Keller stood motionless, Carter's words washing over him. Something was happening inside him, a realization dawning slowly, painfully. All those years, all that cruelty, all that desperate need to dominate and control. And for what? He'd never felt as powerful as Carter looked right now, standing injured but unbowed before a prison in flames. "So what happens to him?" someone called from the crowd. "We just let him walk?" Carter considered Keller for a long moment before responding. "No, Officer Keller will face justice, but not our justice. That would stain what we've built here. He'll face the justice of the world outside these walls." They'll protect him, another voice protested. They always protect their own. Not this time, Carter replied with quiet certainty. Not with what we've gathered. Not with what we've documented. He gestured to Zay, who held up a small flash drive. Every abuse, every cover-up, names, dates, recordings, all ready to be sent to every news outlet in the country. Keller felt the blood drain from his face. Everything he'd done, exposed to the world. His name, his face, his actions, all laid, bare for judgment. You can't do that, he said, his voice barely audible. Carter's expression remained neutral. I already have. Whether it gets released depends on what happens next. From beyond the fence came the amplified voice of a tactical commander. This is the Louisiana State Police. The facility is surrounded. Release all hostages and surrender peacefully. A ripple of tension moved through the gathered inmates. The endgame was approaching. Soon the tactical teams would breach the perimeter, and the brief period of inmate control would end, likely in bloodshed. Carter raised his hands, calling for calm. They're coming in. We all knew this moment would arrive. But remember why we did this. Not just for revenge. Not just to hurt those who hurt us. We did this to be seen. To be heard. To force them to acknowledge our humanity. He turned to Keller. And that brings us to your final purpose here. What do you mean? Keller asked, a fresh wave of fear washing over him. You're going to walk out there, Carter explained, pointing toward the main gate. You're going to tell them what happened here. The full truth. You're going to carry our message. Big T stepped forward, skepticism written across his face. You trust him to do that? After everything? I don't need to trust him, Carter replied, because he knows what happens if he doesn't. He held up another flash drive. This one goes directly to the FBI. Detailed accounts of every crime committed in this prison by inmates and by staff, including yours, Keller. The threat hung in the air between them. Keller swallowed hard, understanding the choice being presented. Become the messenger or become the scapegoat. Either way, his life as he knew it was over. Before you go, Carter continued, there's one more thing you need to see. He nodded to Zay, who stepped forward and handed something to Keller, a small, leather-bound book. Keller recognized it immediately. Warden Grayson's private ledger, the record of bribes, kickbacks, and under-the-table deals that had kept Holt Penitentiary running as a profitable enterprise rather than a correctional facility. Page 42, Carter instructed. Read it carefully. Keller opened the book with trembling hands, finding the indicated page. There, in Grayson's meticulous handwriting, was a list of incentive payments to guards who maintained order through any means necessary. His own name appeared multiple times, with sums that far exceeded what could be explained as performance bonuses. He was paying you to be his attack dog, Carter said quietly, to do his dirty work while he kept his hands clean. The betrayal stung, though Keller knew it shouldn't have. He'd always suspected Grayson's motives weren't pure, but seeing it, laid out so clearly, his brutality reduced to a line item in an accounting book, stripped away any pretense that he'd been serving a greater purpose. They're going to want someone to blame for all this, Carter continued. Someone to take the fall. Grayson's already positioning himself as a victim, the warden overwhelmed by a violent uprising. But that ledger tells a different story. The tactical commander's voice boomed again. This is your final warning. Release all hostages and surrender peacefully or we will breach the facility. Carter looked at Keller with something approaching pity. Time to choose, Officer Keller. Walk. Out there as our messenger or stay here and burn with the rest of us. Keller looked around at the faces watching him. Inmates he'd abused. Holloway with his conflicted expression. Big T with barely contained rage. Zay with youthful intensity. And Carter with that same unnerving calm that had always unsettled him. He saw the burning prison, the approaching tactical teams, the end of everything he'd known. I'll do it, he said finally, his voice hollow. I'll tell them. Carter studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of his words. Good. But remember, We have eyes and ears everywhere. If you betray us, if you lie about what happened here, everything comes out. Your career, your freedom, your life, all gone." Keller nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "I understand." Carter gestured toward the main gate. "Then go. And know that whatever happens next, whatever story you choose to tell, you'll never have power over us again." As Keller turned to leave, Holloway stood, stepping into his path. Their eyes met, a silent communication passing between them. "It didn't have to be this way," Holloway said quietly. "I know that now," Keller replied. "Too late." Holloway didn't move, his face troubled. "What will you tell them?" Keller considered the question, aware of Carter watching from the platform. "The truth, or as much of it as they'll believe." "And then?" "Then—" Keller's voice trailed off. He had no answer. There was no then for him. No future he could imagine beyond the next few hours. Holloway seemed to understand. He stepped aside, allowing Keller to pass. "Good luck." The words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what was to come. Luck had nothing to do with it now. As Keller approached the main gate, flanked by 2 inmates ensuring he didn't try to run, he felt Carter's eyes on his back. The man he'd tried so hard to break had, in the end, broken him instead, not through violence or cruelty, but through the simple power of remaining human in an inhuman place. At the gate, the inmates released his arms and stepped back. One of them, a man Keller vaguely recognized from C Block, whispered, "Remember what happens if you lie." Keller nodded, too numb to respond verbally. Through the reinforced glass, he could see tactical officers in full gear, weapons ready. When they spotted him, their posture changed, alert for any threat. He raised his hands slowly and pushed through the gate into the no-man's land between prison and freedom. Immediately, officers rushed forward, weapons trained on him, shouting commands he could barely process. He was grabbed, pushed to the ground, handcuffed, standard procedure for anyone emerging from a riot situation. "I'm CO Keller," he managed to say as they pulled him to his feet. "I have a message." From inside. They hustled him away from the gate, toward a command center set up in the parking lot. Behind him, Holt Penitentiary continued to burn, orange flames licking at the night sky. From somewhere in the yard came a unified chant. Hundreds of voices, joined together. "We are human. We are human. We are human." The tactical commander, a stern-faced man with the insignia of the State Police Special Operations Unit, met Keller at the perimeter. "Report, officer. What's the situation inside?" Keller looked back at the burning prison, at the flag still, visible above the yard, at the place where he'd wielded power for 15 years. Then he looked at the commander, at the assembled tactical teams preparing to storm the facility, at the media vans already gathering at the outer perimeter. The truth or the lie, Carter's justice or the system's protection, a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "Sir," he began, his voice steadier than he expected, "there's something you need to know about Holt Penitentiary." Behind him, the chanting continued, carried on the smoke-filled air. As dawn approached, one thing was clear. Holt Penitentiary would never be the same, and neither would Dwayne Keller. 3 months after the Holt Penitentiary riot, the facility stood as a hollowed shell of its former self. Entire wings remained closed, damaged beyond immediate repair. The administrative building had been gutted by fire, its windows boarded up, its records largely destroyed. Yellow caution tape still cordoned off sections of the yard where structural engineers hadn't yet declared the ground safe. But the prison was operational, after a fashion. National Guard troops supplemented a skeleton crew of corrections officers, most of them new hires, the veterans having transferred or resigned in the aftermath. Inmates had been redistributed throughout the Louisiana prison system, with only a fraction of Holt's original population returned. Among them was DeShawn Carter. Back in a cell in C Block, his injuries long since healed, his demeanor unchanged. The bruises had faded, the split lip mended, the cracked ribs knitted back together. Physically, there was little evidence of what he'd endured, but everything else had changed. Carter sat on his bunk, a paperback open in his hands, though his eyes weren't focused on the pages. Outside, the sounds of construction, hammers, drills, shouted instructions, provided a constant reminder of the riot's legacy. 3 months of cleanup, and still, the work continued. Carter, visitor. He looked up to find a young guard he didn't recognize standing at his cell door. The man's uniform was crisp, his expression carefully neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. Another change. The new administration had made it clear that the old ways of doing business at Holt would not be tolerated. Carter set his book aside and stood, hands visible at his sides as per protocol. The cell door slid open electronically. The manual locks had been replaced during renovations. "This way," the guard instructed, leading Carter through the block. Other inmates watched as he passed, offering subtle nods of acknowledgement. His status had been cemented by the riot, not as a leader of violence, but as something more enduring. The man who had faced down Keller and won. The man who had chosen justice over vengeance. The man who had reminded them all of their humanity, in a place designed to strip it away. They walked through corridors that still bore the scars of that night. Scorch marks on the walls, patches of new paint covering graffiti, repaired fixtures where destruction had been most severe. The physical wounds would heal eventually, but the memory of what had happened at Holt would linger for generations. At the visitation room, the guard ushered Carter to a booth in the far corner, separated from others for privacy. The plastic divider that normally separated inmates from visitors had been temporarily removed for cleaning, leaving only a table between the two chairs. 10 minutes, the guard said before stepping back to a respectful distance. Carter sat wondering who could be visiting him. He had no family left on the outside, no friends who weren't serving time themselves. Legal visits were conducted in a different area. This was personal. The door on the visitor's side opened, and Carter felt a jolt of recognition as Dwayne Keller stepped through. The former CO had changed dramatically in 3 months. Gone was the confident swagger, the imposing presence, the aura of untouchable authority. His shoulders slumped slightly, his face lined with new wrinkles, his eyes holding a weariness that hadn't been there before. He wore civilian clothes, a button-down shirt, khaki pants, both slightly rumpled. He hesitated before approaching the booth, eyes scanning the room as if expecting a trap. When he finally sat opposite Carter, he kept his hands flat on the table, visible, non-threatening. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The gulf between them, filled with years of abuse, the night of reckoning and all that had followed, seemed unbridgeable. "Didn't expect to see you again," Carter finally said, his voice even. Keller nodded, his eyes briefly dropping to the table before meeting Carter's gaze again. "Didn't expect to come back, but here we are." "Here we are," Carter echoed. "Though, you're on the other side of the table now." A faint grimace crossed Keller's face. "Lot of things have changed." That was an understatement. After the riot, Keller had done as promised. He'd told the truth. About the systemic abuse at Holt. About Warden Grayson's corruption. About his own role in creating the conditions that had led to the uprising. His testimony, combined with the evidence Carter had gathered, had sparked multiple investigations, indictments, and a complete overhaul of the Louisiana Department of Corrections. Grayson was awaiting trial on numerous charges, from embezzlement to civil rights violations. Ray Henshaw and several other guards associated with white supremacist groups had been fired and charged. Reforms were being implemented slowly but steadily throughout the state prison system. And Keller himself had avoided prosecution only by cooperating fully with investigators, trading his testimony for immunity. He'd lost his job, his reputation, his identity as a powerful man. The cost of truth had been everything he once valued. "Why are you here?" Carter asked, genuinely curious. Keller seemed to consider the question carefully. "I've been asking myself that same thing. Spent the whole drive down trying to figure out what I wanted to say to you." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I guess I needed to see you." to make sure it was real. What was real? The riot? The evidence? Your downfall? All of it. Keller's voice dropped lower. But mostly I needed to see that you're still unbroken. Because if you are, then maybe. He trailed off, but Carter understood the unfinished thought. If Carter could endure everything Keller had done to him and retain his humanity, then perhaps there was hope for Keller to find something salvageable in himself. I'm not going to absolve you, Carter said quietly, if that's what you're looking for. I know. Keller nodded. I wouldn't believe you if you did. Silence fell between them again, less tense than before but still weighted with the past. I've been seeing someone, Keller finally said. A therapist, part of the agreement with the feds. Carter raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She's got me looking at things, at myself, at why I did what I did. Keller's fingers tapped nervously on the table. She says I was afraid, that all that control, all that cruelty, it came from fear. Fear of being powerless, fear of being nothing. And what do you think? Carter asked. Keller met his gaze directly. I think she's right. I think I was terrified of being the kind of man who gets pushed around, who doesn't matter. And I made damn sure everyone else was more afraid of me than I was of anything. Until you weren't the scariest thing anymore. Yeah. A bitter smile touched Keller's lips. Until tomorrow came. The word hung between them, a reminder of the psychological warfare that had preceded the physical battle, of messages scratched into metal and whispered in passing, of the slow, deliberate erosion of Keller's certainty. The others ask about you sometimes, Carter said, changing the subject slightly. Big T's A. Where are they now? Big T got transferred to Angola. Zay's at Jefferson Parish, minimum security. His sentence got reduced for cooperating with the investigation. Keller nodded slowly. And you? Why are you still here? Someone has to be, Carter replied with a slight shrug. Someone has to make sure the changes stick, that things don't slide back to how they were. And that's your job now? It's my purpose. Carter leaned forward slightly. I survived 15 years in this place by finding purpose in small things. Now I have a bigger one. Keller studied him with what might have been respect. You could have killed me that night. You had every reason to. Killing you would have made me like you. It would have proven you right about who I am. Carter's expression remained calm, but his eyes held intensity. And I spent too many years proving you wrong to throw it away like that. The truth of it struck Keller like a physical blow. All those years of trying to break Carter, to reduce him to the animal Keller believed him to be. And in the end, Carter's greatest victory had been refusing to become that person, even when given every opportunity for revenge. Time's up. The guard called from his position near the wall. Keller glanced at the clock, surprised that 10 minutes had passed so quickly. He started to stand, then hesitated. I have one more question, he said, voice low. That night in the yard when I left to talk to the tactical team, you knew I'd tell the truth. How? Carter's expression didn't change. Because I'd already won. You just hadn't accepted it yet. The guard approached, signaling that the visit was truly over. Keller stood, struggling to find the words to end this strange encounter. I don't expect forgiveness, he finally said. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know. I'm trying to understand what happened, what I did, why I did it. Carter stood as well, his posture straight, his presence somehow filling the small booth. Understanding is a start, but it's not enough. What would be enough? That's not for me to say. Carter's eyes held Keller's without wavering. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. The guard stepped closer. Let's go. Carter. As Carter moved to follow the guard, Keller called after him, unable to let the moment end without some form of closure. Will I see you again? Carter paused, looking back over his shoulder. For the first time in their long, painful history, a genuine smile touched his lips. small but unmistakable. "Tomorrow, Keller," he said simply. Tomorrow came. Dwayne Keller sat in his car in the Holt Penitentiary parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, unable to make himself start the engine and drive away. Through the windshield, he could see the prison rising against the clear Louisiana sky, wounded but standing, changed but enduring. Just like Carter. He thought about the man he'd spent years trying to break, the man who had ultimately broken him instead. Not with violence or cruelty, but with an unshakable sense of self that no amount of abuse could touch. Tomorrow came, Keller repeated softly to himself, the words taking on new meaning. Not just the arrival of the dreaded day, the fulfillment of a threat, but something more profound, the possibility of change, the inevitability of consequence, the hope, however faint, of redemption. He started the engine and put the car in drive, leaving Holt Penitentiary behind. Not forever. He carried too much of it with him for that. But, for now, for today, tomorrow would come again. It always did. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.